question, Shirley. And also follow the, RSPH and their work on commuting and well-being, which I read and then think, oh my God, what am I doing? So thanks for the evidence on that. And it's great to be here today. And we were just talking about this, just the range of people, the numbers of you and the range of you from the institutions, organisations, places that you come from, which is really fantastic. So it's great to be able to speak to you today. I've got rather a big title here, Where to Put Your Efforts. You'd be glad to know I'm not going to tell you where to put your efforts, given following on from the great presentations earlier about those are choices for you and in particular for communities and local people. But hopefully it's a whistle-stop tour through some of the evidence, particularly going back to Sally. I am going to bombard you with some evidence here, but there's also references at the back of the presentation so you can follow up at your leisure. So I'm not going to dwell on anything for very long, but just a sense from where I come from. As Shirley said, I have a background as a health economist, a recovering health economist. So that, I think, health economics is really helpful in helping prioritise, but should not dominate, should not be the only input into making local decisions. I firmly believe that, always believed that as a health economist. So a whistle-stop tour. So it is a really non-trivial question. I think the debate that we had earlier on obviously signals that. Having said that, we developed on the basis of some work, particularly for local authorities around 2013-14, as we're taking on their new roles in public health or returning to their roles in public health, a bit of a ready reckoner to give some sense of where, if you put your efforts in area X, what might that lead to? But again, not meant to be a determinant, not meant to direct. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about a quick review of the economics. This is truly whistle-stop. Some of the tools, including some that Public Health England have and are currently developing, and then a little bit of a caution about using some of these things, not to follow them or to think about them in context. So quickly, how to decide? Well, there are many ways to do that. You all know this from your local experience. We can prioritise by the size and scope of the problem. If it's a trivial problem, then maybe we shouldn't be prioritising a response to it. We can also, and I'll come more onto this, really critically, particularly in health and all policies, the interdependence between problems. What Martin was saying about connections between problems and connections between how we try and address them. As a health economic background, you'd expect me to talk about the cost effectiveness of interventions for problems. Even if things are really complex, if we can't do anything about them or it costs us so much, and that might be money, it might be many other things, to address them, we have to really think about how we allocate our time, our resources, whether that's money or not, or more actually in our world, actually people and effort towards those problems. We can also look at the return on investment of intervention for problems, and it's at the bottom here, but it underpins everything, public views and engagement. All of these are completely legitimate ways to think about prioritising. But they each have pros, I'm not going to go into detail there, and they each have cons. And the ones I'm going to talk about the economics, one of the really challenging things about the economics is, the economics is often on, and particularly in wider determinants of health, you focus on what you can measure. So we don't always have good measures of wider determinants of health, their impacts, which again goes back to Michael's point about evidence really has to help decision making. We need evidence. And those things we have no data for tend to get neglected. But in a way, even more important, that equity is not well handled with economic tools. There are some emerging techniques to try and include equity in these decision-making tools, but they're still very, very young. So if there's one message you take away from me today, it's don't get totally blinded by the economics and the return on investment, all these lovely numbers you see, because they don't really handle equity very well. You always have to think about inequity alongside economic tools. So in practice, a combination of approaches are going to help you prioritise, and that's what you're going to do locally. What's really important is clarity, why you choose one method over another, or why a combination of methods, and why, and then explaining that to your local populations, your local decision makers. Having said it's really complicated, and it is, this was something from, as I say, this is on our website, and you've got all the links. This is the summary we looked at the evidence back in 2012-13, so this is a little bit out of date now, particularly with Public Health England's work and the LGA's work. But this was a sense of, and this is judgment-based, it's based on evidence, but it's not systematic review. So just again, very, very clear, this is our thinking, our thoughts, trying to look at, if you're focusing on some of these areas around health and all policies, what's our judgment based on our reading of what local authorities can do and are doing on how big is the scale of the problem, how big is the strength of it, how strong is the evidence, how big is the evidence on the impact on health if you actually do something, how quickly might that happen, and how might that contribute to reducing health inequalities. And this was a sort of, Ready Reckon's 2 grand a term, it's a table as you can see, and that was our judgment at the time. And then as importantly on the interdependence, actually we know if you intervene in active and safe travel, the nature of things, you're going to have an impact on the other health and all policies. So we're trying to help you think through the interdependence. If I focus on best start in life, how does that actually then contribute to some of the other priorities you're also interested in? So these tables are very, very simple. They are backed up by evidence. We're not saying it's not systematic review evidence necessarily. Some of the evidence is stronger than others. Trying to summarise that in something which is easy and accessible to start a conversation, to help you start thinking. And the tables can be used in various ways. So if you're focused on quick wins in your local area, then table 1 might lead you to look at helping people find good jobs and stay in work, because the impact on health happens there quite quickly, and active and safer travel. If you really want to focus on reducing good inequalities, that table might point you more towards healthy schools and pupils and access to green spaces. If you're looking at long-run impacts, then you want to also look at table 2, because we know spatial planning is really important and impacts on most of the other areas. So although it might not come up as a sort of like a very quick win, actually getting planning right really helps make everything else work together. And then it's a crude way perhaps to sum up the overall impact of the intervention area. And it is a crude way, and we're not pretending it isn't. So that's intended to, maybe if you might want to take that away if you haven't seen it and just have a look at it, see whether it makes sense for you. That was our attempt to sort of try and draw out some of the implications of the evidence at that time. I'm now going to go on to a whistle-stop tour, maybe not quite as fast as Martin, and certainly not as passionate. I'm not going to talk about the Arab Spring, there I've done it, I have talked about it. A quick review of the economics. So I would point you to, and again, this is all sort of like be in your packs and on the slides at the end, I'd point you towards 4 or 5 resources to get you into this quickly. First off, a quick review by NICE, which is published in the Journal of Public Health. I think it's still free access last time I looked, so you can download this stuff. What was interesting about that, of 200 programs assessed by NICE up to that time on public health, 15% were cost saving. More importantly to me, 85% cost less than 20,000 per QALY and 89% less than 30,000 per QALY. The movable guidelines around what's cost effective when we think about NHS spending. So virtually all of those interventions came in under NHS NICE guidelines. But, and this is also really important, not everything we do in public health or health and all policies is going to be successful. And it's as important to find that out and to understand that, to know what we shouldn't be doing as well as what we should be doing. So about 5% were about 30,000 per QALY, which might not be particularly good value for money if you accept those guidelines as good guidelines. And 5% were more costly and less effective than the comparators. So not everything works, so we should accept that. Of course it doesn't. Now, I would say the interventions here range, they were mostly around individual level interventions. And that's because that's the nature of where the evidence is at the moment. But included in there were things around physical activity, substance abuse, social emotional well-being, screening, workplace wellness programs. So certainly some health and all policy type interventions, but not just health and all policy interventions. So I'd take a quick look at that. I would say this, wouldn't I? I'd take a quick look at our stuff, which is prettier, might not, and more purple. And pink, this was a branding decision between the King's Fund and the LGA. They like pink, we like purple, so we've got this horrible puce colour here. And so we were summarising some return on investment studies too. If you put in efforts in one area, what returns might you get? I'll come back to the caveats on this sort of stuff later. This was really, really popular, partly because it is pretty, partly because it's simple and accessible, and I think that's a message for us. We're trying to make these arguments. We have to make things as accessible as possible, but behind them there are some really complex arguments and messages. And I think arguably we went too simple on this stuff, and I'll talk a little tiny bit about that later, maybe in the discussion. Michael's team and PHE published this, and I helped on this, Understanding the Economics of Investment and Social Determinants of Health. That takes some of the Kingsford work and takes it further and updates it. And there are quite a few tables around various evidence reviews that they did on cost of illness, wider cost of society, cost effectiveness, cost benefit, social return on investment type statistics. And again, all the references you can pick up later. The WHO has also been good. This is red, orange, I think. It looks orange to me. Around, I don't know whether you can see this, environmental determinants, social determinants, resilience, behaviours, things like vaccinations, so sort of more health protection type stuff. They did a big review. The green is where there's a positive return on investment. The orange is where it's cost effective. The black is best buy, and they define that as a triple win with health, social, and I don't know what that means. And that should be environmental benefits. So again, go to the WHO for more details on that. But there are some buts here, and I'm a health economist, so I think this stuff is important and helpful. But there are buts, and we should all be aware of them. First off, many of the benefits, and you know this intuitively, but when we look at deep down into these studies, many of the benefits, particularly on return on investment from local authority spend, flow to the NHS and in the value of health. So if you're spending as a local authority and you see these big ROI figures, you need to break that down. How much is going to come back to you? And I think this goes back to the point that Martin was making and others this morning, and Sally too, and Michael, around you've got to think about this as a place-based thing. If we start focusing on organisations saying, what is it that I get back for this, particularly when we're talking about cash, we are going to underinvest and distort our spend on health in all policies. And I think that's one of the key messages for me that needs to come out of today for you and for us in our roles in our institutions in sort of talking about this stuff. Return on investment is a really nice phrase. It sounds great and it's simple, but underneath, you've got to get underneath the bonnet to work out what exactly is going on. And you will only get this return if we think about place. And we literally are all in this together because the returns flow to different organisations and institutions. And if you look at under virtually any ROI study, you'll find that, and I suggest that you do that. So there's a caution using this stuff. Some useful tools. I found these really useful. I've used some of them. PHE has developed some very useful tools alongside NICE. Particularly Excel-based tools, so you can plug in your numbers. They are not easy. I would say that for me, I'm a health economist, they're not easy to use, so you need to have somebody alongside you, maybe an economist or your analyst in your local place to help you use them, because they are quite complex things. They're meant to be as accessible as possible. By their nature, this is not simple stuff. There's a spend and outcome tool, which helpfully compares local authorities to their neighbours around how much they're spending on certain things around the health and all policies areas, and then the outcomes that they're getting, so you can help benchmark yourself too. And PHE is currently developing more of these tools, including one on housing, which I think will be really useful when it comes out. And the thing at the bottom there is really quite helpful. In a way, that summarises in a nice little Excel sheet a lot of the information you've seen previously. So go to it's quite hard to find, but it is on PHE's website. And really nice in Excel sheet, you can choose various things and areas that you look for. So it's a more dynamic place to go for some of that data. So to conclude, I think economic data, evidence and tools can help decision making in health and all policies, but they shouldn't dominate. They need to be used with care, can't be relied on alone. For me, as long as you invest your time and effort in them, they help clarify your thinking. That's one of the benefits of them. What are we really trying to achieve? That point about measurement, I do think we need to measure, because if we don't measure, sometimes it doesn't count. sometimes we forget it, and particularly in the speed of decision making and how decisions are made. If only things were different, but this is the reality to some extent. So where we can measure, we should measure. Different economic tools are suitable for different jobs. That really important point about particularly ROI, the gains flow to all sorts of different sectors. You need to be really aware of that, and therefore don't misinterpret or misuse them, because it's very tempting to say there's an ROI of 6 to 1 in this intervention. Go and do this, and then you go and do it, and you find actually, well, those gains have gone somewhere else. They haven't come back to my organisation. So this stuff has got to be place-based. And finally, equity is handled really poorly. I haven't really talked about that, but they don't tend to talk about inequalities. You can bring that into them, but that's quite hard. You have to think about inequalities alongside them. Don't just get focused on the cost effectives or ROI type numbers. So that was probably not more than 15 minutes, so apologise. Thank you very much.